This is a guide on how to quickly get started with understanding ASP.NET Web Forms, and you should be able to create a very basic web application. So in this video is only going to be very high level introduction to some main parts of ASP.NET Web Forms. We are going to cover UI components, Lifecycle Events, ViewState, and some other files to be aware of. The main goal of Web Forms it's just to make web development on the .NET framework as easy as possible. And as a result, a lot of what a developer should be manually doing is abstracted away. The very first thing is the drag and drop, dragging and dropping common HTML controls onto a page. Also, on this drag and drop, ASP.NET gives you complex data controls and validation controls. And some of these are gonna, if you didn't have these out of the box, it was gonna take you a long time to create them on your own. And these are fairly common in most applications. So out of the gate, WebForms is very convenient on the UI front. In the simplest form, most UI components in WebForms have two sections. These are often lumped together. There's a presentation part or the front end where you're going to place your HTML or sometimes even JavaScript. And then there's also the code behind or the controlling part. This is where there's going to be the C# code behind for responding to the UI. So in a way, if you want to get very technical in terms of maybe design patterns, you can say that WebForms is really trying to mimic a model presenter controller pattern. But in practice, most developers are not really. So if you're doing WebForms, you wouldn't really be following any strict patterns. It actually turns out that most developers just sort of go and freestyle and they do their own thing. And if we really want to put WebForms into maybe a bit of a box in terms of patterns, it turns out that it's mostly going to be just the presenter and controller, and the two are really tightly coupled. And pretty much most of the interaction is done with the code behind. The interaction to the code behind is done via events. So now just the UI components. If we were to just get started with an example, you can actually just create a web application right now, right away. And all that you would really need to know is a master page, a user control, and there's obviously going to be some common front-end assets, these are not strictly .NET, CSS and JavaScript. Most of the UI components, such as the page, the master page, and the user control, like I've said before, they've got this, pretty much all of them have got this code behind. This would be different from another pattern, MVC, Model View Controller, which is a lot more intuitive or a lot more straight out of the box. That's made for the web. That's made for web development. And there are no abstractions, or the .NET doesn't hide anything to do with the web. So a developer is going to have to sort of do a lot of the work himself. Okay, now in terms of just creating a quick application and explaining these UI components, that's the master page, user control, and the page. Let's just create a simple page that adds a product. So this is going to be a form that's if you're just adding a new product. And a new project in Visual Studio, this is going to be fairly straightforward. I mean, a master page, all the pages are going to use the design of the master page. And the page is typically just a template for all other pages to follow. So if we wanted to change the CSS or the JavaScript, we only need to just change this one master page. And then the master page will also contain common items across the entire site, such as the navigation, the footer, and the shared styling. And a web application is not really limited to having just one master page. There can be as many as you feel. Then moving on to the page, again, straightforward, self-explanatory. page will have the content that's most unique to it, to the page, and it will also have a corresponding code behind to respond to any events such as button clicks, drop-down changes. So the page is really the main thing, and it doesn't actually need a master page. You can just have a blank page without anything fancy to it. Then user controls. These are optional, and one can think of them as widgets or smaller UI components. These really just help in breaking a complex page into subcontrols. So instead of lumping all the UI designs onto the one page, you can create subsections or widgets, place them in the user control, and in some cases, a user control can be shared across different pages. And then finally, there are the common UI items, CSS, JavaScript, under the content and script folders. So UI components, I mean, fairly straightforward, nothing complicated, nothing difficult. So let's create a page. Once again, to add a new product, instead of placing the controls directly onto the page, we're going to put them on the user control and then simply just place this user control onto a page. This page is going to be based on a master page. Okay, so now that we've done the UI, let's just run this very simple example. And there, it works. It's done very quickly. Rapid application development, pretty quick, nothing complex. And let's just neaten the presentation, or maybe add some div, or use the already default built-in Bootstrap. And here's our slightly better presentation. Okay, so pretty much this can be a development cycle or development pattern for building a much bigger web application. You're simply just going to be dragging and dropping controls onto any UI component. This could be a page, a user control, or maybe if you are a little bit more advanced in terms of the raw HTML, you could create, but they have to be user controls so that you could read them in the code behind. So, I mean, creating pages is fairly straightforward, very simple, but it's very, very important for a backend developer to keep in mind that ASP.NET is doing a lot of the work in the background to make things work very smoothly. So a developer is going to have some basic understanding of lifecycle events. At the moment, this form doesn't do anything. There's no submit button. So let's just add this submit button. And now the most important thing would be lifecycle events. This is the part that sort of starts to trick and trip and confuse most developers. I mean, even those who've been using WebForms for a long time. And basically, in short, WebForms communicates with the code behind by events. So we've added this button. We're going to double click it to create an event in the code behind. Please note, I am adding the button to the page and not to the user control. So if I want more user controls, the main event or the main driver for this submit button is going to be on this page. On the code behind, we can see our submit events. Very easy, intuitive to understand. But where things start to get very complex and confusing is that there are many other lifecycle events that a developer has to understand. In summary, every UI component, being it a page, a user control, or master page, will go through stages where all the controls from the server up until they are fully rendered into as a native natural HTML, they go through different stages. These stages are initialization, loading, postback event handling, and rendering. So this could be just a summary of the stages. Okay, now these are only the summary of the stages. And for each stage, there could be a number of events. So the complete picture looks something along these lines. Just an example, for the loading stage, there's a preload, a load, and a load complete. And then for the render, there's a pre-render, render complete, save state complete. So it's quite a lot to take in. and maybe a little bit too much to remember all at once. But a developer who's doing WebForms has to be aware, there are all these events before a control that's been done in WebForms as an ASPX control. For it to be fully rendered, it has to go through all those stages. The most simple event to understand is the post back. So this is where a user, let's say a user clicks a button or there's a drop down list item that's been changed. That's quite intuitive, easy to understand, because now the developer is sort of more or less expecting it and waiting for that event. The other events that happen automatically when loading or refreshing a page, typically there'll be the page load event. And in some fewer cases, just before the page load, there's the page init. So these two events, the page load and the page init, that's where most of the code will be sort of hooked up. You're going to hook into these events as a developer. So then a very common pattern on the lifecycle event is to check if a page refresh or a page load is caused by a post back. So in other words, is the page loading because there's an HTTP GET, or is it loading because there's an HTTP post? So that's one way to think of this post back event that you're going to be checking. So now, just as a quick illustration on the page load event, this is typical for most web applications that are using WebForms. You're going to be running this check. If it's not post back, then do something. For example, bind the categories or do something. Now, coming on to ViewState, which is another very important concept in WebForms. This feature can be explained. A quick way of explaining it would be to ask a question. So where does WebForms store the data that gets added to the form, so dynamically during the runtime of the application? For example, if we have a drop-down where there's an option that gets selected, without ViewState, after doing a post back to the code behind, when the page reloads again, the selected value is forgotten, so it wasn't stored anywhere. Now, ViewState is a way for WebForms to keep some state between post backs. It's a hidden field on the form because it's trying to store data over time and over, as the application is running for maybe a longer time after many different post backs. This ViewState starts eating up a lot of memory, and it starts cluttering and bloating the page. So a developer using WebForm also must know that there's this illusion of having state between post backs, but it's not really it. It's just a hidden form on the actual page, which can very quickly get cluttered and filled up from just using it as a storage mechanism. Some other files to keep in mind in the project. There's also the Web.config, which is simply where all the configuration settings, such as connection strings, this is where all the settings are going to go. And if you've only worked with the latest .NET project templates, Web.config would be the equivalent of the app-settings.json. And then there's also the Global.asax. And there are a lot of uses for this file. And one of them would be where you can set the error page, which page should be the redirect if there's an exception or an error. Another use would be for setting up dependency injection. So now the modern equivalent of global.asax is the program.cs. So to just quickly try and tie up all these basic important concepts in a way of a demonstration, WebForms typically has UI components, and each one of them would have their own code behind. UI components are the master page, the actual page, and the user control. It's important to know and understand the lifecycle events because, even the most experienced developers, this can get very, during runtime to try and debug and follow what the actual code is doing, it can get very tricky. Just as the most straightforward event to understand is a straightforward postback, this is initiated by just the user directly taking action on a page or a control, such as pressing a submit button or when you want to handle a drop-down event change. But behind the scenes, there are more lifecycle events that a developer doesn't control, but can only add logic or hook into those events. The most common one is the page load, and before the page load, there are other events where the most common is the page init. ASP.NET WebForms really tries and aims to mimic much of the desktop development as much as possible. The quickest win is to have the drag and drop controls, but then there's also the ViewState, which is a hidden field that stores some state of the controls. So for configuration data, we've got the Web.config, where you're going to store items such as the connection string. And then the Global.asax, a whole lot of configuration in this file, such as setting up dependency injection.